Welcome to the St. George's University Office of Research presentation on funding for research opportunities and the processes involved in applying for internal and external research funding. My name is Dr. Randall Waechter. I'm the Associate Director of Research here at St. George's University. So we have some objectives for this presentation. So first, we want to differentiate internal from external research grants at SGU. Describe the process of applying for internal research grants at the university. Describe a little bit of the history of external granting agencies and how they got funded. Identify 3 external funding agencies. Describe the steps in gaining approval to apply for an external grant at SGU. Identify the steps in writing a grant proposal. And identify 3 tips for writing a successful external grant proposal. So why do we do research? Well, it's challenging, it's time-consuming, it's anxiety-provoking, and sometimes it's just downright frustrating. Well, we do it though because of the enormous potential benefit it creates and the sense of satisfaction it can create for the researcher. So for me personally, it's about giving back, creating something new, and obtaining a little bit of a slice of immortality. So unlike building a bridge or even a office tower or a building or even constructing an entire city, which all deteriorate with time, discoveries and knowledge never fade. So as long as civilization exists and that knowledge that is created is able to be passed down from generation to generation, then whatever it is that you create, that new knowledge will live on long after you're gone. And so clearly research from that perspective is valuable and it's integral to the function of society. And remember that universities were established in medieval times by European rulers and city governments to satisfy this desire for new knowledge and the belief that society would benefit from the discoveries and scholarly expertise generated from within these institutions. And so the word university is derived from the Latin Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, which roughly means community of teachers and scholars. And so here at St. George's University, we build that community of teachers and scholars, and we work towards the creation of new knowledge as a key component in the function of every university on earth. And how we measure that impact is by looking at the new knowledge that we create and the impact that we have, or that new knowledge has more specifically, on communities and on society in general. And of course that helps us to be better teachers because then we can incorporate that new knowledge into the teaching that we're providing for our students. So we can measure the impact of our research in many ways. In medicine and public health, we can measure individual health and well-being using concepts such as years of life lost and years lived with a disability and disability-adjusted life years. In the social sciences, we can measure community cohesion and social support systems and economic activity. Infrastructure, communication, and education. In business, we can measure efficiency and profits. And in engineering, we can measure new technologies. And the one concept that supersedes all of these is return on investment, or the amount of desired outcomes achieved with a given input into our research endeavors. And as we talk about external granting and external granting agencies and writing those applications, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of return on investment when you're trying to convince a donor to provide funding for you. So we know that this ROI concept is really significant, and we want to take it into account when we're trying to procure external funds. And like everything else in life, research, costs money. So to be a return on that investment, there has to be an initial investment. So how do you get some of that funding for your work? Well, there are 2 major options at St. George's University: internal or institutional research grants and external research grants. And so let's start off by looking at internal research grants and how you go about procuring some of those funds. So we do have the Small Research Grant Initiative at St. George's University. This is carried out by the Office of Research. And SGU currently provides approximately 50,000 US dollars per fiscal year to support the Small Research Grant Initiative within the Office of Research. Given the goal of the Small Research Grants Initiative is to procure pilot data for the eventual submission of an external research grant, the budget for internal funding should focus vehemently on data collection. The procurement of small equipment and supplies and lab consumables that are not currently available on campus are common expenses because those are the expenses that are going to help the researcher to procure the data that he or she needs to support an eventual external grant application. So funds to procure samples and local ground transportation and sample collection consumables are relatively common. Payment to individuals such as research participants or research assistants is therefore discouraged. Right? We don't want to spend those funds on paying individuals. We'd rather spend those funds on procuring samples, and because of the importance of including students in our research activities, we would rather see research assistants volunteering their time to assist with sample collection and data collection as a valuable teaching tool in the research process. And that helps not only the researcher to keep the costs of the project low, but it also helps to include students in the process, and it's a valuable learning opportunity. Now, where do you go if you want to apply for a small research grant? Well, the application forms can be found on the SGU Office of Research website. The link is provided in the PowerPoint presentation. You can also come to the Windrift building, which is located right beside Anatomy, behind the flagpoles, where the Office of Research is located, and you can ask anyone in that office about the Small Research Grant Initiative, and they will guide you. As appropriate, the proposed research must have received approval from the Institutional Review Board or the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee prior to submission for funding. You need to attach all the appropriate documents and send those documents via email to the appropriate individual at the Office of Research. If Grenada government personnel, facilities, or resources are to be utilized, the approved clearance forms from relevant government ministries must also be attached. Again, those documents are available on the Office of Research website, and you can also gain access to those documents by contacting anybody in the Office of Research, again located in the Windrift building. If your study involves surveying SGU students, faculty, or staffs, the approved clearance forms from the SGU Survey Committee must be attached. This committee exists to make sure that we're not overwhelming students, faculty, and staffs at the university with surveys, and we're not asking the same question multiple times. And so that is why that system is in place. All applicants must complete the Small Research Grant application form and submit it with a copy of the proposal to the Office of Research for distribution to the Small Research Grant Initiative committee members. The committee members consider the application, all applications, and respond to the applicant generally within 10 working days. Okay, now let's talk about externally funded grants. We'll start by looking at government agencies, and then we'll look at non-government agencies. And if you will indulge me for a few minutes, we'll walk our way through a little bit of history to understand how these agencies were formed in the first place, which is instructive in helping us to be able to write a compelling grant application to increase our chances of actually securing an external grant. So this is something you might not have known. The National Institutes of Health, which is one of the largest government-funded research institutions in the world, was actually started as a marine hospital for the U.S. Navy, specifically under the Relief of Sick and Disabled Seamen Act of 1798, which was enacted by President John Adams. The idea behind the act was to collect a fee from each foreign vessel arriving in the United States, in this case 20 cents per sailor per month, And this money was sent to the US Treasury and used to build port hospitals. So anybody who studied public health, you would know that many pathogens travel in history in past times via sailing vessel. And so this was known. So the idea was to make sure that anybody coming in was able to be treated in hospital, to be quarantined if necessary. The word quarantine comes from quadragena, which is Italian for 40 days, because the boats would sometimes be mandated to remain in harbor for 40 days before anyone was allowed to depart from the vessel, and to be able to investigate and treat any of those sick sailors. So we see that it really has its roots not only in trade, but also in the military. So looking at maintaining the health and well-being of sailors, Navy sailors, and soldiers who are there to protect the United States. Now, by 1870, a network of marine hospitals placed under the charge of a medical officer within the Treasury Department where the funds were going. And by the late 1870s, Congress allocated funds to investigate epidemics like cholera and yellow fever. That resulted in the creation of the National Board of Health, making medical research an official government initiative. The hygienic laboratory was established at the Marine Hospital in New York to study bacteria by 1887, and by the early 1900s, Congress began appropriating funds for the Marine Hospital service. The hygienic laboratory was redesignated as the National Institutes of Health and given $750,000 to construct 2 NIH buildings in the 1930s. And over the next few decades, Congress greatly increased funding to the NIH, and various institutes and centers were created within the NIH for specific research programs. In 2021, the NIH total budget was $43 billion, so a very large sum of money being allocated directly to research activities for diseases that impact human health. Now, there are a number of external government granting agencies. This is a list of government and quasi-government agencies which have provided funding to St. George's University faculty members in the past. And so we have been successful in procuring funds from a number of different organizations. Okay, let's discuss non-government charitable funders like we did with the NIH. Let's take a little walk through history to understand how these agencies were formed, which again is instructive in understanding how they are run and their purpose, and we can use that information to help us in procuring funding. So let's look at the Wellcome Trust. This is out of the UK, which was founded by Sir Henry Wellcome, who was born on the American frontier in 1853. In 1880, he moved to the UK with Silkus Burroughs to found a pharmaceutical company. And Wellcome became a leading figure in the pharmaceutical industry, developing antitoxins for tetanus, diphtheria, and gangrene. He was a very curious individual who carried out rigorous research. When Sir Henry Wellcome died in 1936, his will provided for the creation of a charity with his significant accumulation of wealth. And so this was a quote from the British Medical Journal on the foundation of the Wellcome Trust in 1936 upon the death of Sir Henry Wellcome. The main asset at that time was share capital of Sir Henry's company, the Wellcome Foundation, and the idea was to use profits from the company to advance medical research in a charitable fashion. That spending started relatively low, £1.2 million for the first 20 years or so, but spending increased between 1952 and 1986 as the Wellcome Foundation's sales grew significantly from £10 million to £500 million. The Wellcome Foundation was worth $1 billion in 1985, and research grant allocation was about £2.6 million annually. The Wellcome Trust was the only shareholder of the Wellcome Foundation, and in 1995 the trust sold most of its remaining capital in the Wellcome Foundation to Glaxo, which is another pharmaceutical company. The assets grew from $3.4 billion in 1988 to £20.9 billion pounds in 2016, and the average annual charitable spend grew to about 1 billion pounds by 2016. So that's an example of a private foundation. Now, there are other examples out there. The Gates Foundation is another perfect example. And these are usually individuals who have accumulated significant wealth through industry or entrepreneurial activities. Now, we know where the money comes from when it comes to external granting. How do we identify those grant opportunities? Well, it is a little bit of an art rather than a science. So it's a similar process to identifying which journal to submit your article to. You kind of create a wish list and submit your application to the top choice, and then you see if it gets accepted. And if it doesn't, maybe you then go to your alternative choice. And it's a matchmaking process, right? So it is an art. You're looking for the benefit to both parties. So there needs to be a good fit between your idea and the funding agency and what the funding agency is trying to achieve. Okay? Though we live in a shrinking world, where you live and are carrying out your research does still matter. So remember that lots of funding comes from national government-run agencies, and so we also need to keep in mind that while the National Institutes of Health has a lot of money to give out to research, some of the opportunities listed by the NIH might not be applicable to researchers and research projects here in Grenada. Now, of course, also the funder must have funds available, and even then there is hyper competition for that funding. So fewer than 5% of all grants submitted to the NIH end up actually getting funded. That means that the proposals of even very experienced researchers get rejected. And to help our chances, we build our expertise and we partner with mentors in the particular field of research where we want to carry out our studies. And like anything else, it's about tenacity. I've always said publishing is a war of attrition. Grant making is also a war of attrition. You just have to be unbelievably stubborn and persistent about it and just keep applying, and keep applying. Eventually, you'll be successful. So it is important that SGU and WINDRIF being the administration organization for external funded grants that come in to faculty members at St. George's University, we have to be aware of what grant applications are being submitted to external funding agencies at any given time. And so we need to work closely with faculty members who are submitting those grants. And there's a number of reasons for this. So first of all, we have to ensure adequate physical facilities and human resource support is available from within the university where applicable to support the grant activities that are being proposed by the faculty member. Second, we have to ensure that the research investigators have included an adequate budget within the grant to support the grant activities and ensure that they have the resources that are needed to be successful with the grant application and the implementation of the grant aims, but also that there are resources needed to administer the grant. So, for example, we need accounting systems in place, we need financial management systems in place, we need auditing capacity in place because especially with larger grants, a lot of funding agencies require annual audits and independent audits. And then the third point is because we want to provide peer review, advice, and feedback to the investigators prior to submission to ensure that they have the best possible chance for successfully securing that external grant in a very competitive environment. We've just talked about the fact that 5% or fewer of applications to the NIH get funded. So you're going to go through all that work. You want to give yourself the best possible chance of actually getting funded. So we have documentation through WINDRIF that should be filled out for any faculty member that is interested in applying for an external grant. So it's pretty basic. We just want to know the name of the principal investigator, the name or names of co-investigators, and the names of other faculty members or SGU affiliated individuals, such as students and staff members, who will be involved with the project, if known at the time of application. We want to know what is the target funding agency, so where you're going to try and get the money to carry out the study, the title of the project or a working title if not yet finalized, the duration of the grant in years, the total amount of funding being sought, and of course the submission deadline, because we want to make sure we meet the deadline and that there's enough time to actually get the grant written and submitted before the deadline. Now, I can tell you that the biggest problem we face when looking to apply for external research grants is timing. So we'll have faculty members who will approach us and say, hey, I want to apply for this external research grant and it's due in 3 days or in 1 week. And our response is, that's nearly impossible. That's not enough time to go through the process to ensure that everything is in place and to get the grant written and reviewed and going through all the necessary steps in the channels to get it submitted in time. So the most important thing, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, when you're looking for an external grant, is give yourself enough time to be able to go through the process of applying. So the faculty member works with the grants administrator in the Office of Research to establish a timeline for grant submission. And so this process looks like this: completing an application that is sent to the PI's department chair at least 20 business days prior to the submission deadline. The department chair then responds with any feedback and clearance to submit the application within 7 days of receiving it. Now, why do we go to the department chair? Well, because we want to make sure that your department chair is aware of your intent to apply for an external grant as a faculty member in that department, and that if you're successful, you have the time and the ability to actually carry out the grant activities. So you've worked with your department chair to make sure that you're covered and that you can carry out your teaching duties, administrative duties, as well as the research that you intend to carry out. The PI sends a revised application to the grants administrator at least 6 days prior to the application deadline. The grants administrator provides edits and feedback to the PI within 4 days. The PI then revises and resubmits the final grant application to the grants administrator at least 1 business day, that is 24 hours prior to the submission deadline. The grant administrator then works with the PI to ensure the submission of the application prior to the funding deadline. External grant applications should, wherever possible, budget for indirect funds, again, to support grant administrative costs. So again, we have to have accountants, financial management, auditing all in place to be able to run our external research grants office in Windriff. And so we need to make sure that we're providing budgets for all of those external costs outside of the direct research activities to cover off and keep the Office of Research the external grants office running. The grants administrator will work with faculty investigators and Windriff finance team to ensure post-award reporting back to the funding agencies. And again, sometimes we see that funding agencies require external audits as a stipulation of providing funding. So when it comes to actually writing the grant proposal, you want to think of that return on investment. Okay, remember we talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the presentation. You want to approach grants from the right perspective from the very beginning to guide your overall writing. And I thank Dr. Paul Fields in the Office of Research for providing this outline. First, you want to think of this as a business agreement or a partnership or a contract or a loan. Okay, so once you've identified a grant opportunity and you've notified the appropriate individuals and it's time to write your application, think about, from the perspective of the grantor, the funder, what are they looking for? Well, they've got money to spend, and so they want to look for a way to allocate that money that makes the most sense, that provides the best return on investment for them. And what is that return? Well, it's new knowledge. It's the discovery of something important in a field of area or field or area that is identified as their prime area of interest. Okay, and so as the applicant, you want to think, how do I provide the best possible return or impact for the funder so that then they can put in their portfolio, look at all the great things that I've been able to partner with researchers and discover because of the funding that I've invested in these researchers. So how do you do that more specifically? Well, you first need to identify the problem it is that you're going to address with your research, okay? And you want to make sure that you identify how important that problem is and how urgent it is, because there's no shortage of problems in the world, right? So why is your problem urgent right now? Why does it need to be funded and examined right now? Then you want to provide your solution as an innovative response to the problem. And you want to explain why your solution is innovative. Why is it different compared to all the other solutions that currently exist? That's where you need to be familiar with the literature. Then you also want to explain why your solution is reasonable and sensible. So why is it better? Why does it make more sense? What is the innovation? Why is this going to be important? And how is this going to move the field forward to help more people? Then you wanted to explain why you are the individual to carry out that research, your legitimacy to implement the solution. And that means you have to be trustworthy, right? Because they're handing you money to carry out your research, and you need to be capable. So you need to demonstrate that you have the expertise and the background and the knowledge to successfully carry out the project that you're proposing. And then finally, you want to look at that return on investment. So what is it going to cost to carry out your research? And what is the potential benefit that's going to come out of it? And hopefully the benefits are much higher than the costs. Then more nitty-gritty details of writing your proposal, right? You want to answer the question, what are you trying to do? And you want to articulate your objectives using as little jargon as possible. So that is answering the question, what's the problem? How is it done today? And what are the limits of the current practice? So this is answering the question, what are the current solutions? And this is, again, where you need to be very familiar with the literature and the current systems or solutions that are in place. What's new in your approach, and why do you think it's going to be more successful than what currently exists? Who cares? So why is this important to do? What is the impact on society in general, right? Is it a disease that has wide prevalence and impact, such as depression, for example, like a mental illness, which we know is very prevalent? And if you're successful, what difference is it going to make? What is the potential impact? What are the risks and payoffs? So no project is perfect. So what are the potential pitfalls, and how are you going to address those risks? How are you going to mitigate those risks? How much is it going to cost, and how long is it going to take for you to carry out your research? And what are the midterm and final checks for success? How do you know if you've been successful at the end of your project? And then finally, how are you going to disseminate the results out there to the wider world? That's what we would sometimes refer to as knowledge translation. Okay? And then the last piece I'm going to leave you with, or the last hint or piece of advice, is always to put yourself in the mindset of the funder and then the reviewer, because funders bring together panels of reviewers to review these grant applications and to rate them, to judge them, to score them, and determine who should be funded. And this usually involves, at least pre-COVID era, a group of experts coming together for a week at a time, holed up in a hotel conference room, reviewing hundreds of applications. This is not a particularly fun process. These people are not having fun going through this. And so you want to make sure that you've written the best possible proposal you can. Your writing is clear, the English is good, there are no grammatical errors or no spelling errors, because if it's not written well, then you're going to annoy these people. And if they get annoyed, then they're likely going to lower their score for your application, and it's going to impact you before you even get started. And so keep that in mind. Do the best you can to really proofread, have other people proofread your application, and give yourself, most importantly, the time to write an effective and compelling grant application. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always reach us at the Office of Research and we'll help you out. And again, always give yourself plenty of time when looking to apply for an external research grant. Thanks.